They first realized the night belonged to the Japanese on Guadalcanal when darkness did not bring rest, but a new kind of terror that American training had never prepared them for. The Marines had dug their foxholes around Henderson Field, believing that the fall of night would slow the enemy. Instead, it unleashed him. In the black, humid air of the jungle, Japanese soldiers moved as if born from the shadows, slipping between palm trunks and kunai grass with a silence that felt supernatural to men raised on structured, daylight maneuver doctrine. The first night attacks were not full assaults, but probes. Single rifle cracks from unseen positions, the thump of a knee mortar, whispers of movement just outside the perimeter. The Americans answered with bursts of Garand fire, but each shot seemed to vanish into an endless wall of darkness. They could never tell whether they had hit anything. The jungle devoured sound, twisting direction, turning a simple snap of a twig into the illusion of an entire platoon. Anxiety built with every hour of darkness. Then came the real attacks. On August 21, 1942, at the Tanaru, the Japanese charged the Marine lines in waves, screaming banzai as they rushed forward with bayonets, grenades, and machine guns. But the screams were only the final act. The real danger came beforehand. Japanese infiltrators crawling up through the sandbars and brush, trying to cut gaps in the wire, probing for the weak points. They used the night not just as concealment, but as a weapon. They understood that fear spreads fastest when a man cannot see. Marines fired into the dark until their rifle barrels glowed, but the attackers seemed to come from every side. Even after daylight revealed hundreds of Japanese dead, the Marines could not shake the first lesson. These were enemies who preferred to fight when Americans could not see their own hands. A few weeks later at Edson's Ridge, the truth struck even harder. Japanese troops under General Kawaguchi moved through the jungle as a fluid mass, small squads slipping between ravines, feeling for openings. At times, they infiltrated so deeply that Marines found enemy soldiers inside their command posts. A runner appeared out of the dark yelling that the right flank was collapsing, only to learn moments later that the message was outdated. The collapse had already begun. Men fought with knives, rifle butts, and entrenching tools in close combat, where even muzzle flashes blinded more than they illuminated. Edson later wrote that his Marines fought ghosts. They knew the Japanese were close, but never exactly where. The problem was not courage, it was doctrine. American pre-war training assumed that night limited both sides equally. Maneuver was discouraged. Units were taught to halt, dig in, and wait for dawn. Japanese forces, with years of combat experience in China and a tradition dating back to the Russo-Japanese War, embraced the opposite philosophy. Night was an opportunity. They rehearsed silent movement, bayonet attacks, and coordinated infiltration. Their soldiers memorized paths through the jungle by touch, not sight. They attacked from the darkness because they knew the Americans feared it. And the fear was real. In New Guinea, soldiers of the 32nd Infantry Division learned how vulnerable they were when Japanese units slipped through kunai grass and crept to within 20 meters of American positions before opening fire. Many night attacks began not with a volley, but a single grenade or a whispered signal that sent attackers rushing forward in sudden explosive violence. Calls for help over radios blurred together. Leaders struggled to maintain control when half their platoons couldn't see each other. In both Guadalcanal and New Guinea, American defensive lines often dissolved into clusters of isolated foxholes. Soldiers fired at sounds, at shadows, at movements that might have been enemy scouts or might have been nothing at all. Every rustling leaf became a threat. Every minute felt like an hour. And worst of all, Japanese attacks rarely followed a clear pattern. Sometimes they charged in massed formations, sometimes they crawled within 10 yards of machine gun nests before springing their assault. Sometimes they circled for hours, wearing down nerves until the Americans' trigger discipline fractured. The darkness magnified every weakness in American doctrine. Lack of night fighting training, lack of illumination tools, lack of coordinated perimeter defenses. The Japanese did not overpower the Americans through numbers or firepower, but through mastery of a battlefield the Americans did not yet know how to survive. Before the Marines and soldiers could learn to adapt, They had to endure the most difficult period of their early Pacific campaigns, the realization that when the sun set, the battlefield no longer belonged to them. It belonged to the Emperor's infantry, and until America found a way to fight at night, victory would always hang in the balance. The Americans entered the Pacific War with an assumption inherited from World War I and years of peacetime doctrine. Night was a time to halt operations, secure positions, and wait for daylight. Darkness, according to U.S. manuals, increased confusion for both sides and was therefore unsuitable for offensive action. But the Japanese had spent decades proving the opposite. From the Russo-Japanese War to the brutal campaigns in China, their infantry had refined a doctrine that treated night not as an obstacle but as an equalizer, an environment where discipline, silence, and individual initiative could dismantle a technologically superior enemy. When the Americans landed at Guadalcanal and trudged through New Guinea's jungles, they discovered that everything they had been taught about fighting at night was dangerously obsolete. The deficiencies showed immediately. U.S. units lacked formal training in night movement, night shooting, or coordinated defensive procedures in low visibility. In many rifle companies, only officers carried compasses, and even they struggled to keep bearings in terrain where dense jungle canopies swallowed moonlight. Soldiers were not trained to fire by sound or silhouette. They were not prepared to maintain unit cohesion when separated by more than a few yards. And they were unready for opponents who could move through darkness as if guided by instinct. Meanwhile, the Japanese 17th Army and South Seas Detachment were masters of infiltration. They drilled extensively in silent approach techniques, using hand signals, muffled movement, and rehearsed routes. They memorized terrain features as shadows and shapes. Their squads operated with a flexibility that American platoons, bound to daytime maneuver doctrine, could not match. Japanese troops often advanced in small fire teams that probed the perimeter for weak points, exploiting gaps between foxholes or slipping through unguarded ravines. And they did so with a confidence built from experience. Night attacks had served them well in Shanghai, Nanjing, and Hong Kong, and they saw no reason they would not succeed again. Terrain magnified these differences. Jungle acoustics distorted every sound. A twig snapping 10 yards away could echo like a rifle shot. A Japanese scout belly-crawling through palm roots could approach within a few meters before anyone sensed him. American machine gun teams reported firing at phantoms. No enemy in sight, just the unsettling certainty of movement in the brush. New Guinea was even worse. The kunai grass grew taller than a man's head, forming alleyways and channels that funneled movement and made it impossible to see attackers until they were dangerously close. Rain turned the ground into mud that dampened footfalls. Japanese units used this terrain expertly, slipping to within 15 or 20 meters before beginning their assault. Many fights began not with gunfire but the sudden scream of attackers bursting out of the grass with bayonets fixed. U.S. infantry doctrine assumed that automatic weapons like the bar and belt-fed machine guns would establish fire superiority and break enemy assaults. But in darkness, these weapons were harder to employ effectively. The bar's front sight disappeared against the jungle, and machine gunners often struggled to identify targets through tracer arcs alone. Meanwhile, Japanese soldiers relied heavily on bayonets, grenades, and the Type 100 submachine gun, ideal tools for close-range shock attacks. Their knee mortars, Type 89 grenade dischargers, could drop explosives into foxholes from unseen positions, further eroding cohesion. Leadership broke down quickly at night. Squad leaders couldn't see their men. Platoon commanders struggled to relay orders when whispers risked detection and shouting risked panic. Worse, American lines often had gaps, 30, 40, even 50 yards between foxholes, because jungle density and manpower shortages made continuous trenches impossible. Japanese infiltrators exploited these gaps relentlessly. A single squad might slit behind American lines, fire from the rear, and trigger confusion that made units believe they were surrounded. The lack of illumination compounded the crisis. Early in the campaign, U.S. forces lacked adequate flares, star shells, or portable lights to expose attackers. Without illumination, fire discipline crumbled. Soldiers emptied magazines at shadows, leaving them vulnerable when the real attack struck minutes later. These weaknesses were not mere tactical inconveniences. They were systemic failures. American infantry doctrine had not anticipated an enemy that excelled in nighttime jungle warfare. The Japanese had built an entire combat culture around speed, surprise, and shock delivered under cover of darkness. The Americans, by contrast, were learning on the battlefield what they had never been taught in training camps. It would take months of brutal trial and error before they understood how to survive the night, much less win in it. By late 1942, the Americans finally recognized that surviving Japanese night attacks required more than courage and more than firepower. It required tools and doctrine specifically built for darkness. The turning point began not with a single innovation, but with a series of overlapping adaptations. Technology that exposed the enemy, defensive geometry that denied infiltration, and tactical procedures that reshaped how American units fought after sundown. At Guadalcanal, the first breakthrough came with the arrival of the SCR-270 radar, a bulky but groundbreaking early warning set capable of detecting incoming aircraft long before visual spotters could see or hear them. Though originally designed for long-range detection of high-altitude bombers, the SCR-270 provided the Cactus Air Force with a precious advantage: time. Japanese bombers approaching at night, once able to surprise Henderson Field with sudden flare drops and fragmentation runs, were now detected early enough for anti-aircraft crews to prepare, and for fighters, when fuel allowed, to scramble into advantageous positions. Radar could not stop ground infiltrators, but it prevented the crippling nighttime air raids that once softened the perimeter for infantry assaults. The next adaptation was illumination. At first, Marines improvised with rifle-fired flares and makeshift torches, but by October 1942, U.S. forces began to employ star shells fired from 105mm and 75mm artillery batteries. A single star shell suspended over the battlefield turned patches of jungle into harsh daylight, revealing Japanese attackers frozen mid-advance or crawling through grass. Mortar crews learned to fire cascades of illumination rounds, one bursting as the previous faded, creating light corridors that extended along likely Japanese approach routes. Even a few seconds of light could break the momentum of an attack. Flares forced Japanese troops to drop to the ground, ruined their timing, and stripped away the psychological advantage of invisibility. But technology alone could not fix the Americans' night vulnerabilities. Their defensive doctrine itself had to change. The early perimeter lines on Guadalcanal resembled scattered foxholes connected by vague lines of fire, adequate for daytime defense but nearly useless at night. After several near breakthroughs, U.S. commanders redesigned their positions into what became the prototypical Pacific War defensive perimeter, a continuous, ring-shaped defense with interlocking arcs of fire, forward listening posts, and depth positions to absorb penetrations. Machine guns were placed not at the front but at angles, creating overlapping kill zones. Mortars were pre-sighted on likely avenues of approach and given fire missions specifically designed for nighttime engagements. Outposts were pushed 20 to 50 meters ahead of the main line, so infiltrators would alert defenders early. Trip flares, though unreliable in the jungle moisture, were used wherever possible to create instant illumination and signal a breach. On New Guinea, where jungle density limited fields of fire, American engineers carved small lanes through the brush, just wide enough for machine guns, to prevent Japanese troops from crawling unseen within grenade range. Units were taught to maintain fire discipline at all costs. No firing at noises, no wasting ammunition, and no revealing positions until confirmation of an actual attack. This was a radical shift from the panic-driven bursts of earlier months. The new doctrine transformed how American soldiers behaved at night. Instead of sitting in fear, waiting for the Japanese to dictate the moment of violence, units now managed the night through routine, scheduled illumination, coordinated listening posts, and pre-arranged counterattack plans.
One of the most effective changes was the use of final protective fires, pre-planned automatic weapons and artillery concentrations to be triggered instantly if Japanese troops breached the wire. Once set in motion, these fires created impenetrable curtains of bullets and explosions, often halting entire Japanese battalions in seconds. At Bougainville in 1943, these methods reached full maturity. When Japanese forces launched massive night assaults in March 1944, attacks that would have shattered the Marines on Guadalcanal a year earlier, the new perimeters held firm. Radar provided early warning of supporting air raids. Star shells lit the jungle canopy like a stadium. Machine gun teams executed interlocking fire without hesitation. Mortars maintained continuous illumination. And Japanese soldiers who once slipped through the dark with impunity now found themselves caught in kill zones they could neither see nor escape. The night, which had once been Japan's greatest weapon, was beginning to turn against them.
The process of adapting to Japanese night tactics did not end with radar and illumination. It required a transformation in how American infantry understood the battlefield after sundown. Beginning in early 1943, first in New Guinea, then across the Solomons, U.S. commanders rewrote their approach to night fighting from the ground up. What had once been a period of paralysis and fear became a structured, disciplined environment governed by doctrine, routine, and rehearsed responses. The first major shift came in marksmanship. The Americans had entered the war with training built almost entirely around daylight accuracy, sight alignment, controlled breathing, deliberate aiming. None of those principles mattered in a jungle where visibility often dropped below 10 meters. So instructors developed silhouette fire, a technique in which soldiers fired at shapes rather than fully visible targets. Instead of waiting for perfect sight pictures, riflemen were taught to aim by muzzle flash, movement, and the outline of helmets or shoulders illuminated by flares. BR gunners, previously taught to conserve ammunition, were now encouraged to lay down controlled bursts to break up infiltration attempts at close range. Machine gun teams learned to fire at pre-planned azimuths, creating predictable walls of fire that compensated for the blindness imposed by darkness. The second adaptation involved listening posts and outposts, small 2- or 3-man teams positioned 20-40 meters ahead of the main perimeter. Their job was not to hold ground, but to hear and warn. These teams served as the earliest tripwires, often detecting Japanese movement long before visual contact. It was dangerous work. Many were the first killed when Japanese patrols probed the lines. But the information they provided allowed commanders to adjust machine gun angles, alert mortar crews, and ready illumination rounds before the main assault crashed into the perimeter. At Buna and Gona in Papua, U.S. infantry also began experimenting with counter-ambush techniques, flipping Japanese tactics back on them. Instead of waiting defensively, American patrols moved through the jungle at dusk and dawn, setting up their own ambushes along likely infiltration routes. When Japanese squads attempted their usual night approaches, they often walked directly into concealed American rifle and bar teams. These counterattacks not only broke up planned assaults, but also forced Japanese units to slow down and become more cautious, eroding the confidence that had once characterized their night operations. Mortars became central to the new doctrine. The 60mm and 81mm weapons, light enough to move through the jungle, were now used not only for explosive fire but as illumination platforms. Mortar crews trained to fire alternating shells, HE, illumination, HE, creating a rhythm of light and shadow that disoriented the attackers. Japanese soldiers accustomed to moving invisibly in darkness now found themselves lit by sudden bursts of harsh white light that destroyed their timing and cohesion. The psychological effect was immense. The night no longer guaranteed protection. American engineers also reshaped the battlefield. At Munda, New Georgia, and especially Bougainville, they cut fire lanes through the vegetation to prevent infiltrators from crawling unseen toward the perimeter. They emplaced concertina wire in irregular patterns, Z-shapes, serpentine arcs, forcing attackers into narrow gaps pre-sighted by machine gun teams. Mines, though difficult to maintain in wet jungle conditions, were placed along dead ground and depressions where Japanese troops typically gathered before attacks. Perhaps the most significant change was in command and control.
Early in the war, unit leaders struggled to maintain order at night. Soldiers fired at sounds, panicked when cut off, or assumed they were surrounded when a single Japanese squad slipped behind the lines. By mid-1943, the Americans had implemented strict night discipline. No shouting, no uncontrolled firing, no movement without authorization. Passwords changed nightly, platoons drilled in darkness until they could navigate positions by touch. Officers now carried luminous compasses and small red-filtered flashlights. Runners memorized pathways through the perimeter. Most importantly, units rehearsed final protective fires, where every squad, machine gun team, and mortar crew knew exactly what direction to face and what sector to defend if the Japanese breached the wire. These changes turned fragmentation into coordination, fear into readiness, and reactive panic into structured defense. By the time U.S. forces reached Bougainville in late 1943, they were no longer novices stumbling through darkness. They were seasoned jungle fighters who understood how to shape night combat instead of enduring it. And the Japanese, once masters of the dark, now found themselves attacking an enemy who had learned how to erase the advantages of shadow. Mortars became central to the new doctrine. The 60mm and 81mm weapons, light enough to move through the jungle, were now used not only for explosive fire but as illumination platforms. Mortar crews trained to fire alternating shells, HE, illumination, HE, creating a rhythm of light and shadow that disoriented the attackers. Japanese soldiers accustomed to moving invisibly in darkness now found themselves lit by sudden bursts of harsh white light that destroyed their timing and cohesion. The psychological effect was immense. The night no longer guaranteed protection. American engineers also reshaped the battlefield. At Munda, New Georgia, and especially Bougainville, they cut fire lanes through the vegetation to prevent infiltrators from crawling unseen toward the perimeter. They emplaced concertina wire in irregular patterns, Z-shapes, serpentine arcs, forcing attackers into narrow gaps pre-sighted by machine gun teams. Mines, though difficult to maintain in wet jungle conditions, were placed along dead ground and depressions where Japanese troops typically gathered before attacks. Perhaps the most significant change was in command and control. Early in the war, unit leaders struggled to maintain order at night. Soldiers fired at sounds, panicked when cut off, or assumed they were surrounded when a single Japanese squad slipped behind the lines. By mid-1943, the Americans had implemented strict night discipline. No shouting, no uncontrolled firing, no movement without authorization. Passwords changed nightly. Platoons drilled in darkness until they could navigate positions by touch. Officers now carried luminous compasses and small red-filtered flashlights. Runners memorized pathways through the perimeter. Most importantly, units rehearsed final protective fires, where every squad, machine gun team, and mortar crew knew exactly what direction to face and what sector to defend if the Japanese breached the wire. These changes turned fragmentation into coordination, fear into readiness, and reactive panic into structured defense. By the time U.S. forces reached Bougainville in late 1943, they were no longer novices stumbling through darkness. They were seasoned jungle fighters who understood how to shape night combat instead of enduring it. And the Japanese, once masters of the dark, now found themselves attacking an enemy who had learned how to erase the advantages of shadow.
By early 1944, the night no longer belonged to Japan. The same darkness that had once concealed their movements, disoriented American troops, and amplified the psychological power of their assaults had turned into a battlefield shaped and controlled by U.S. doctrine, technology, and discipline. What had begun as a desperate effort to survive Japanese night attacks on Guadalcanal became a systematic transformation of American warfare across the Pacific. And that transformation reached its full expression at Bougainville. When U.S. forces landed in November 1943, the Japanese command believed that once darkness fell, they could force the Americans off the island the same way they had nearly retaken Henderson Field 16 months earlier. They assembled thousands of troops for repeated night assaults, highly coordinated, rehearsed, and launched with the confidence of veterans who had broken armies in China and shocked Marines on Guadalcanal. But the battlefield they walked into was unlike any they had seen before. The American perimeter on Bougainville was not a loose scattering of foxholes. It was a fortress, an unbroken ring of interlocking machine guns, listening posts, mortars pre-sighted on every likely avenue of approach, and artillery batteries ready to fire illumination shells the moment flares burned out. Radar stations detected Japanese aircraft before they reached bombing altitude. Searchlights swept the canopy. Trip flares snapped with sudden brilliance, freezing infiltrators mid-step. The night, once Japan's ally, had become a trap. The first major assault on the American perimeter in March 1944 demonstrated just how far things had changed. Japanese troops moved silently through the jungle, confident their experience would again grant them surprise. But as they approached within 50 meters of the perimeter, trip flares erupted in harsh white light. Within seconds, star shells burst overhead, turning the battlefield into a shifting mosaic of shadows and exposed silhouettes. Machine guns opened fire in overlapping waves. Mortars traced the jungle floor with explosions. Japanese soldiers who had expected confusion instead found themselves caught in kill zones mapped days earlier. Some tried to retreat, but American artillery, already dialed in on preset coordinates, blocked their withdrawal. What shocked Japanese survivors most was not the firepower, but the coordination. The Americans no longer panicked in darkness. They no longer fired wildly at sounds or shouted contradictory orders. Every squad knew its role. Every gun had a lane. Every illumination round was timed. For the first time in the Pacific War, Japanese commanders realized they were attacking an enemy who understood night combat as well as they did, and who now held the technological and tactical edge. The pattern repeated in assault after assault. Japanese troops charged, believing momentum and aggression would break the American lines. Instead, they ran into belts of barbed wire they had not detected, ambush positions that directed them into enfilading machine gun fire, and counterattacks executed with calm precision. Units that once relied on silent infiltration found themselves illuminated and destroyed before reaching grenade range. Even Japanese veterans admitted in diaries that by 1944, the Americans had stolen the night. In New Guinea, too, the tide had turned. At Itape and Hollandia, U.S. outposts detected Japanese night movements early through listening posts and roving patrols. Mortars kept illumination shells in the sky whenever movement was suspected. Gone were the days when a single Japanese squad could slip behind American lines and create chaos. With tighter perimeters and practiced night drills, American units absorbed infiltration attempts without collapsing or losing cohesion. The Japanese still fought with ferocity and discipline, but their night attacks increasingly ended with devastating losses and little tactical gain. Technology accelerated the reversal. Portable radar sets improved. Flares became more reliable in wet conditions. Night fighting lessons were codified into field manuals and taught to new units before they ever reached the front. What had once been an improvisation born from desperation became a formal doctrine. The Japanese, constrained by limited industrial capacity, couldn't match this technological leap. They lacked radar. Their illumination capabilities were poor. Their night doctrine, once revolutionary, remained static even as the Americans evolved past it. By the end of 1944, Japanese commanders were forced to abandon large-scale night attacks in many campaigns because losses had become unsustainable. The night had ceased to be their domain. It now belonged to an American military that had learned, through blood, adaptation, and relentless innovation, to master what it once feared. And in that mastery lay a larger truth about the Pacific War. Japan began the conflict with tactical advantages born from experience and doctrine. But the United States possessed something far more decisive: the capacity to absorb those blows, understand them, and transform its entire way of fighting. The shock of Japanese night attacks had won